delighted to launch our online global series called Daring to Leap. It's a series of conversations with corporations around the world about the importance of ESG and corporate purpose as the new business essentials. As part of our ongoing dialogue with boards and the C-suite, we're often asked, what exactly does the S in ESG mean? How do we measure it? How do we know when we've done it well? And how do we know that we're making a difference? Here to answer these important questions is our guest today, Professor Paul Argenti from Dartmouth Tuck School of Business. Here's our interview.
The S is the most difficult part of the ESG. I mean, I think that the way I look at it and have talked about it and done research on it, the E, sustainability, all of that is kind of both a win for the organization and a win for society generally. As companies strive to become more sustainable, they probably also find themselves saving money. And so it's a twofer, and that's kind of a no-brainer. The G was mandated starting at the beginning of this century by Sarbanes-Oxley and a whole host of other rules that were put in place to try to protect society from corporations. And I think in general, that has been mostly a compliance-based strategy for a lot of organizations. And the only time we really get involved in governance as an issue that really bleeds over the S is when we talk about executive compensation, which is a part of governance. The S, the social, is the last thing that most companies try to tackle. I think of Walmart, which has made a huge transformation in the last 15 years from doing nothing in a lot of these realms to being one of the leading organizations in the world. They started with environmental sustainability issues and moved on to social only in the last 5 or 7 years. And it's because it's more difficult. And I think the reason it's more difficult is that it's an intangible asset that we're trying to talk about. It's much easier to measure the success of a sustainability program or to understand what the possibilities are within the rules of the game for governance. But when we talk about social issues, really we're in no man's land when it comes to trying to think about what to do. Now, what I decided to do in coming up with a framework for when to speak out was to give companies a framework that at least get your thinking started rather than the random approach I saw going on in many corporations. And I started thinking about this about 2.5 years ago, put in a lot of time looking at what other people had written about it before writing the article that you saw in Harvard Business Review. And it basically came down to 3 things that I think shape how we should answer the question whether to speak up or not. The first one is this something that is connected to those values? So is it connected to our strategy in some way, the mission of the organization, the approach that we take for how we look at the world? Then obviously we would have a claim to speak out on it. If it's completely removed from anything we do, there's a scarce amount of resources in the world, both for time and money and all of the things that go into this. We probably ought to not be involved. The second one is, can we meaningfully influence the issue? And do we really have a way of influencing the issue and making something happen? And if the answer to that question is yes, and the answer to the first question is yes, we're kind of on our way to being there and being ready to say something. But the last piece of it is, how contentious will this issue be with our constituencies, our stakeholders? And the way I look at that is, it kind of depends on which constituencies are on your side and which ones are not to make that decision. If you have 3 S's, so it's definitely connected to our strategy, we can do something about it, and our constituencies aren't going to upset. You should not only speak up, you should be a leader on this topic. And I give examples in the article of companies that do that. If you don't have your own house in order, it's difficult for you to do anything externally. So what companies really need to do is to look at what's going on inside the organization. That's where a lot of the pressure is coming from, to be honest with you. Companies didn't get into this because of public pressure or government pressure. It came from their own employees. And you just look at the numbers of, especially when you start to get to more recent generations, Gen Z, millennials, their interest in having their company stand for the right thing to do is growing and is really important and critical to how organizations think about this. So one of the reasons that you want to have a policy in place, whether it's my framework or something that you create yourself, is that you want to have a rubric that you can run by your employees and say, the reason we didn't respond to this is because we didn't want to get accused of woke washing and just jumping on the bandwagon of an issue. But the real place to start is internal, because if it looks like you're dissembling, that you're saying one thing, but actually the way you operate is you do another, that's going to be a very, very difficult position for you to be in. Yeah, I think it's actually easier today than ever before to measure the effectiveness of the S. And part of that is that as a result of big data, we have ways of looking at how people respond to issues and what their attitudes are that allow us to see perhaps how it will be perceived down the road. Goes back to the notion of, do you really know who you are? Do you really understand what you stand for? Have you gone through the kind of exercise that I've gone through with many companies to try to understand what those values are? Do you live up to those values? Do you hire people for those values? And how likely are you to avoid trouble as a result of all of the association with that strategy? That's what separates the great companies from the not so great.